Welcome. My name is Asli Bashir, and I'm a research fellow at the Quattrone Center for the Fair Administration of Justice at Penn Cary Law. I'm excited to welcome you to a conversation with several experts that I'm very excited to hear from on the administration of blind justice, criminal justice institutions, and racial bias. As this year has demonstrated very clearly, racial bias in the criminal justice system has the power to distort decision-making and produce unjust and unfair outcomes in a context where liberty, lives, and futures are at stake. And I think everyone listening can think of many reasons why this is an important time to have a conversation like this. I am aware that we have very limited time on this call, and we have people who have much more important things to say on this issue than me, so I'm going to limit my remarks. I just want to add a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I'd like to thank the two people who've really done a lot of the work organizing this. Eric Hintz, who did a lot of the organizing of this panel and came up with it behind the scenes. He's also a fellow at the Quattrone Center. And Anna Gavin, who allows us to do anything with technology and any event planning, and this would not be possible without her. And of course, I'd like to thank our three panelists who are going to actually introduce themselves. Before we get to the actual conversation, I also just want to note that if you would like to submit a question, please use the Q&A feature found in the ribbon at the bottom of the window on your screen. And please keep your questions topical and appropriate. Anyone posting inappropriate language or content will be removed, although I don't anticipate that happening. And also, it would be important to know that we're recording this webinar, and we will post the recording on the Quattrone Center website if you have to miss a portion of it. And for those of you who are doing this for CLE credit, if you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that the CLE codes will be announced twice per hour. Write down these codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email and is also in the chat. The first CLE passcode is pumpkin, P-U-M-P-I-K-N. All right, great, thank you. And you'll see that the first poll should be launched in the chat now. Thank you. Or just as. Great, so now actually I'd like to hand it off to our illustrious panelists, Matt Clair, Phillip Atiba Goff, and Rasan D. Hall. Matt, if you wouldn't mind starting off and introducing yourself.
Sure. Well, thanks so much, Asli, for leading us in this important discussion today, and the rest of the Quattrone Center for organizing. My name is Matthew Clair. I am an assistant professor of sociology and by courtesy law at Stanford University. And broadly, my research explores how cultural meanings and interactions reproduce, reflect, and also contest and challenge social inequality. And in particular, most of my empirical work has focused on the criminal legal system, particularly the criminal courts. And I have a book that I'm really excited about, and I'm excited to hear people's thoughts on if they are able to read it. It's called Privilege and Punishment: How Race and Class Matter in Criminal Court. It's based in large part on my dissertation research, where I examined attorney-client interactions and how race and class inequalities are embedded in interactions between defendants and their defense attorneys, and then also how it reproduces inequalities, both in material legal outcomes, but then also symbolically. So I'm really looking forward to learning from and engaging with Phil and Rasan as well. So thanks so much for having me.
I guess I'm next. My name is Phillip Atiba Goff. I want to thank Asli, Eric, Quattrone Center, and my other panelists, as well as all of you 168 other folks whose faces I cannot see. The most important thing I think to know about me before we get started is that I am from the greatest city in the history of the world, in Philadelphia. Born and raised. I did live a period of time in Bel Air, and my godchildren do call me Uncle Phil. So you guys get the Fresh Prince theme song into and out of your head as quickly as you can. I'm a professor of African American Studies and Psychology at Yale. I'm also the co-founder and CEO of the Center for Policing Equity. It's the world's largest research and direct service organization focused on racism in public safety. That's a super humble brag because the space is incredibly moribund of funding, and so there's not a lot of other organizations. We also host the National Justice Database, a National Science Foundation funded project, which is the largest collection of police behavioral data in the world. Also a very humble brag. I'm really looking forward to having a conversation about how absolutely anemic our understanding of these spaces are and how desperately we need change.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Rasan Hall. I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. My work encompasses the racial justice priorities of our ACLU affiliate that largely covers police and criminal law reform, as well as prosecutorial accountability. I've been at the ACLU for probably around 4 years, and prior to that, I was at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights in the Boston office, and prior to that, I was a prosecutor in Suffolk County, which is largely Boston, for about 8 years, where I prosecuted any number of gang, drug, and homicide cases over that tenure. And so that experience was very formative and helped inform the advocacy work that I do, that I was doing at the Lawyers Committee, and certainly the work that I'm doing now at the ACLU on really trying to hold police and prosecutors and other actors within the criminal legal system accountable. So I am honored to be a part of this this panel, and in addition to making my contributions, look forward to learning a lot as well.
All right, great. Well, I'm going to launch right into our first question, and I'll ask the panelists to answer in alphabetical order by last name, I guess? Yeah, last name. Let's go last name. So then the first person to answer will be Matt. So this is a question that I think more of these conversations should start with, and they don't always start with this question. But how should we define racial bias? Is the light one. Matt, you could start out.
Yeah, so I think bias is a very specific term, racial bias, and I definitely hope the conversation shifts toward also unpacking other forms such as racism, which I think is a more capacious term. But I think when people refer to bias, we often refer to it as preferences in favor of one group over another. Often bias is talked about at the individual level, but bias also exists and is talked about at the system level. So these are biases of practices or policies or cultural modes of behavior that preference one group over another. The reason why I sort of talk about racism rather than racial bias is because I think often, and this isn't necessarily the case how everyone defines bias, but I think often when we talk about bias, we often think of it as sort of at least at the system level. When we talk about system bias, it's often thought of as an error or unintentional, whereas racism really sort of indicts sort of the functionality and inherent intentionality of some of these forms of system level bias that exist intentionally or were created intentionally to reproduce racial domination. And so I define racism more broadly as an ideology of racial inferiority that generates or reproduces racial domination and exploitation. But I'm curious how everyone else defines it.
So I guess we're going to just keep doing this as the order, and I'm going to keep being mad that Matt gets to go first and take all the goodies. But I'll definitely say I echo Matt's desire to broaden the conversation from one that reduces to bias to one that incorporates the isms. And part of what I'll try and add on to that, we've got really good words to mean really specific things. And social psychology has done a decent job of sort of carving, I think, nature at the joints there. So you've got this idea of a stereotype, which is just the idea, right? You can know that Black people are all supposed to be good at basketball without actually believing that. You can literally watch me play basketball and see that many Black people are terrible at basketball, but still be aware that the stereotype is there. You've got prejudice, which is the feeling, right? And that prejudgment that happens at the lower level. You got the bigotry, which is the endorsement. Right? You got discrimination, which is the actual behavior. And bias is the catch-all for that. You can have racially biased ideas, feelings, endorsements, and behaviors. The reason we need the word racism is because none of those words account for the pattern and the power of history, right? And so I would just, a friendly amendment to Matt's definition of racism, I understand that there's a need to talk about the ideology as a natural outgrowth of it, but I want to root us in the behaviors. And part of the reason why I want to root us in the behaviors is because too often when we talk about bias or prejudice or bigotry, or even when we talk about discrimination, it reduces to something internal to the individual. The most common definition of each of those terms reduces to contaminated hearts and minds of individuals. And when we do that, our conversations about race all over the place reduce to the character of white people instead of the accumulated harms of Black and brown communities and the systems that have grown, that have sprouted up to maintain those. So as we have conversations about how this exists in the criminal legal system, I hope we'll stay rooted as much as possible in behaviors and the systems that support them, right? And that we're not talking about the individual instance, because of course, if racism happened just once in a person's life, we wouldn't need the word racism for it.
So I see how this is going to be. What I didn't say in my introduction is that I'm also an ordained reverend, and one of the things that I hate as a preacher is going after two other fiery preachers, and the thing that we say is they left no meat on the bone. So with this being the lineup for the night, Phil, I can appreciate your frustration. Just imagine mine. In the context of bias, though, I'll say that, as to echo some of the sentiments that both of you have shared, is that it shouldn't solely be limited to the intentional acts motivated by racial animus, but rather the complicity with a system of oppression that disproportionately impacts BIPOC folks, or Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but especially Black people. And it should be defined more broadly by the acts that fail to question the narratives that perpetuate racial stereotypes, or the race-neutral policies that do not contemplate the way racially biased practices exacerbate existing racial disparities, as well as the statements, the actions, the decisions that are informed by an understanding of racial status, caste, or classification, which justifies the resulting racial disparities. I mean, from my own experience as a prosecutor, working with a police officer who justified the arrest of a Latina woman, well, I guess it's redundant, but of a Latina, during an investigation into a home by describing her as a hot-blooded woman, as if that would make a light go on in my head and say, oh yes, that's right, they are highly emotional and hot-blooded, therefore it makes sense that she was disturbing the peace and that you had to intervene and arrest her, right? It wasn't necessarily racially motivated, but there is a belief or an understanding about certain groups of people, right? And those comments or attributes are assigned to an entire class of people or group of people, and it informs the decisions that get made. And when we think about the larger systems of oppression and the criminal legal system in particular, there are all these inflection points and points of decision making that happen from multiple players within the system that go completely unexamined. And the way that societal bias, as informed by race, filters into that system are things that are pretty substantial and difficult to overcome.
All right, thank you for those answers and for the feedback, which is very reasonable. So actually, we're going to switch things up and actually start with, so that everybody can answer a question first. We'll have the second person go first next. We'll just kind of go iteratively. So then Phil will start next, and then Rasan will start the next one. And then for the fourth question, Matt, it'll go back to Matt as the first speaker. Does that make sense? Like, so same order, but we move down one person. So this next question, I would like Professor Goff to answer first. We've kind of gotten into this question at first, so you can expound on it a little more. But building off of this idea of kind of racism, which I think you made a good point about racial bias being a kind of narrower concept that requires talking about theory of mind a little more than is very helpful for this. So how does institutional racism differ from individual racism or racial bias, if that would be better used?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I think it's a foundational question within the space. I have been really, I won't say at this point I'm now surprised, but over the course of my career, it's shocking the degree to which it is so difficult to get groups of people to understand racism outside of individual level character. right? People talk about racism like, oh, we understand that racism is in these, lives in these structures and blah, blah, blah. And they're like, oh, right. And that means this person must be a bigot. Well, no, in fact, you don't need individual level bigotry or prejudice to produce racial inequality, and systems of racial oppression don't require that level of bigotry. In fact, that's just a shortcut heuristic, right? So when we talk about individual level racism, what we're often talking about is the decision that produces the negative outcome, right? Or often, even more frequently, the speech act that we imagine reveals character of an individual actor, right? That's important to understand, because the collection of those speech acts or of those decisions absolutely does produce aggregate outcomes at a policy level, right? At a praxis level, and on the individual level. But what we have a difficult time understanding in general, because human cognition has a hard time understanding it, but particularly in the United States, where we have these myths that we make ourselves up and that we did so out of nothing, as if we had the raw materials and then we got to make decisions on a blank slate who we were going to become. We have a really hard time talking about being honest about systems, okay? And one of the ways that you can think through this is if there were a set of systems, let's say schools, and they just happened to kill 25% of the students that got put in them. No one would want to send their kids to that school. No one would be okay with that, because we think of children as not worthy of being killed. And yet, when we think about substance abuse, when we think about mental health, when we think about the ways in which food deserts and the lack of affordable housing and decent jobs, the ways in which public health has been unresponsive to the needs of vulnerable Black communities, the number of dead is far higher than 25% as a result of our reluctance to directly engage. The things that we tolerate happening to Black and Native people in particular, we would not tolerate happening to other groups. That's how you understand systems are set up to do exactly what they're doing. Perhaps they should be more efficient at doing it, but they're set up to do exactly that. And we don't have good language for that, which is why we end up reducing it to individual stuff, right, to individual level. But we should develop that language, right? Because any system that treats a group of people who used to be enslaved in this country in the way that we treat people who are incarcerated right now has decided that history cannot be embarrassing. It cannot be shamed by the character of the nation, right? Unless it's reduced to the individual level. So the ways to think about it are, what do we permit as a group versus the individual choices? And when you think about it that way, the systemic is far more powerful in predicting how bad things are going to get or what change we need to make. But the individual is far more powerful to our own minds and taking our own shortcuts, in part because for those who worry about being seen as racist, sometimes that's actually the center of the debate. And if I know that I can't be credibly accused of that, because, you know, some of my best friends are, then there's no need for a debate beyond that, right? Or the debate can go left or it can go right, doesn't matter. If I am at the center of this, if my character is at the center, then we don't end up having the healthy conversation about what level at which this is occurring. And we should be talking systemic, because as a person who's been Black pretty much my entire life, it's those systems that are far more harmful than any individual I come up against.
You know, on social media, I every once in a while, I'll say something that engenders a significant response. And one time I tweeted, you know, raise your hand if you are some white person's Black friend. And the type of response that I got was overwhelming. And I think it goes to Professor Goff's point. As long as we individualize the problems within the system, there is always a defense. I never said the N-word. I never owned slaves. I have a Black friend. Then you're absolved of any wrongdoing. And I think that's the significant problem, because when we think about institutional racism, it's embedded in the institutions, which have greater control over a broader swath of society. And so the decisions that are made in healthcare facilities and educational institutions, within our criminal justice agencies, within the economic sector. Those decisions have a very significant impact on a broader array of people. When you think about, maternal health disparities, there's a reason that Black women are more likely to lose their children during childbirth. And it's not because the doctor is in there calling them the N-word. But there are practices and ways that the system operates that lead to these greater disparities. There's a reason why there are huge performance gaps in students, or achievement gaps in educational settings with Black students, and the white teachers are not in there calling their children the N-word. There's a reason why there are substantial wealth gaps in this country, and it's definitely not because Black folks are lazy, but it's not also because that there are bank officers who are saying no to N-words, right? So it's more than that. And I think the failure to examine it at a systemic level is what's always going to be the problem. I think of here in Boston, and in looking through some of the names of the participants, I see a couple names that I recognize, so folks are going to be familiar with this. But in the Boston's public schools, Boston is a majority minority city, 52% people of color. But when you look at the population of students enrolled in Boston public schools, only 14% of those students are white who are enrolled in Boston public schools. But then when you look at the elite exam schools and the most prestigious of those exam schools, the Boston Latin School, that number nearly doubles, and it goes up to 38% of the attendees of this prestigious exam school, which is a public school that the students don't have to pay for, they just have to test into it, and it sets them on a launch pad to a greater trajectory in education, is disproportionately white. And what studies have shown and some investigations have shown is that a significant number of those white students come from a white neighborhood in Boston called West Roxbury. And an overwhelming number of those students from West Roxbury come from a particular school, Holy Name Catholic Church, the parochial school rather, that is notorious for grade inflation. But there is there are these institutional practices and policies, right? There is the independent school exam that students have to take. Well, how do students learn about that exam? Well, there's this feeder, and there's this pipeline, and there's this neighborhood connection, and it never goes examined until recently. And so if it's happening in the educational settings that are helping to promote white students through this institution, how is it happening in our criminal legal system and the law enforcement agencies where there are significant disparities? In Boston, there was a study that showed that even though Black folks only made up 24% of the city's population, they made up 64% of the people who were stopped by police. And when the researchers controlled for crime in the neighborhood, the criminal record of the individuals who were stopped, and alleged gang involvement, there were still significant disparities. A white neighborhood with a relatively comparable crime rate to a Black neighborhood still saw fewer interactions than were found in the Black neighborhood. And so there are these practices that are baked into the institution that go unexamined and have such a tremendous impact on people's lives.
So now I see the pain of going last here after these two brilliant people. So, I'll just add a couple things. One, I just want to sort of highlight also why we need, or why the concept of institutional racism was developed and really theorized deeply, in the 60s. I mean, people and theorists were talking about institutionalized forms of racism prior to that, but we saw sort of a decline of explicit racist attitudes or sentiments in survey analyses over that period. But we kept seeing racial disparities existing, being reproduced, and often even entrenching or growing in certain domains. And so we need an understanding and explanation that goes beyond the individual level, just to sort of reinforce what's already been said. And so one of those explanations was institutional racism. Others, though, do exist at the individual level, such as implicit bias, right? So this is unconscious sort of preferences. And then, of course, also covert bias. Maybe people are just not telling people how they really feel and that they actually do have racist sentiments and beliefs, but they're not telling survey researchers that because they know that it's not sort of the norm now, or at least it was for a period of time in the late 20th century, that racism was something at the individual level, at least, to not be something that you supported. So institutional racism I define as sort of organizational systems and practices that, again, systematically favor one group over another. And just to give some more examples, in addition to the ones that have already been given, I mean, a classic example in the criminal legal system is the crack cocaine sentencing disparity, right? So on its face, it's race neutral, but in practice, it disadvantages Black drug users in comparison to white drug users. The targeting of police surveillance and resources in Black communities, Latino communities, is another form of institutional racism. And then the other thing that I want to highlight is also, we can also talk about systemic racism, and I actually think of systemic racism as slightly different from institutional racism. So institutional racism, in my mind, is sort of focusing on specific organizations and institutionalized practices that are unique to those specific organizations. But what systemic racism does, and both Phil and Rasan have already said this, but sort of if we call it systemic racism, what it does is it shows us how these organizations are interlinked, right? So in how they're recursively reproducing systems and practices of domination and exploitation across organizations that further entrench racial inequalities. So an example in the criminal legal case would be if you are arrested and convicted, maybe you have a collateral consequence, which is going to affect your ability to get housing. And so that leads to sort of housing market discrimination on the basis of your conviction. But of course, that conviction itself was racialized to begin with. But then also maybe, there's an issue with respect to how, because you can't get public housing in a certain neighborhood, or you can't go into the private labor market in even a sort of more well-off neighborhood, then that's going to have effects on the educational attainment of your family, of your children, right? Which we know education is also a racialized institution in the United States and based on neighborhood. Right, so these institutions all sort of recursively reproduce one another, and that's sort of how systemic racism, in my mind, also operates to reproduce inequalities beyond just sort of the inequalities that are existing within discrete institutions.
Thank you all for those answers. I think building off of, Matt's last point, so how does racism manifest in criminal justice institutions? So those include police, courts, prisons, the bar, there are others. And if we could start with Reverend Hall first.
It begins with policing and which neighborhoods are policed and in which ways. Where are the special tactical units deployed? Where's the priority in drug investigations? You mean to tell me that there aren't as much, if not more, drugs on any college campus than there are in any housing development, but yet police resources are deployed to some of the already most policed communities, whereas college campuses, there's this expectation that the people who are there are not the worst of the worst and do not require the level of policing and surveillance that happens in other communities. It happens with the bail requests that are made. I distinctly remember my experience as a prosecutor the first day in the office being asked to make bail requests. There's no framework, there's no rubric to tell me what dollar amount am I going to request to ensure that a person returns to court. But studies have shown that Black people and Latinx people are disproportionately, one, held on bail, but two, also held on higher amounts of bail. And when you think about how bail, people being detained on bail leads to higher rates of people pleading guilty, because how being held on bail disrupts your life, you begin to have a window into how these disparities that begin with the way that policing happens filter through the system. At the ACLU, we did a study of a couple of years of data on a particular set of crimes, because one of the candidates for DA, Rachel Rollins, said there were certain low-level offenses that she would refuse to prosecute, and it caused an uproar. But what I knew from my own experience as a prosecutor were these were the types of crimes that we just dismissed anyway. Simple possession of marijuana, motor vehicle offenses, disturbing the peace, trespassing. Those were the things that we already dismissed, but all of a sudden, now that this Black woman is running for this office, all of a sudden things aren't going to be safe anymore. And when we ran the analysis, we showed that one, the two things that we instinctively assumed was that Black people were disproportionately charged with these types of low-level offenses, but three, that they were overwhelmingly dismissed already. But one of the things that really stood out when we talk about the institutional bias within the system, there were certain segments of the city of Boston in particular where the racial disparity in police stops was 15-1. And that was like in the downtown Boston area where there's not a lot of Black people that live there. And it's hard for me to believe that we're that terrible drivers. I mean, I'm Black and I drive, and my driving record doesn't look anything like this, and I drive in the downtown Boston area. So it suggests that that there is a pattern and practice of behavior that is filtered down through the institution. The way the guilty pleas are leveraged, the sentencing recommendations that get made, the decisions to appeal certain cases. Overwhelmingly, district attorneys' offices will appeal cases where the defendant is not represented by counsel, because if it goes up on appeal and they lose, they're required to pay some of the attorney's fees. And so overwhelmingly, you have individuals who are indigent, who are making the landscape of legal precedent with their cases, which is overwhelmingly unfortunate. So those are some of the ways that these biases show up in the system because of who is overwhelmingly within the system. And then when we think about photo arrays and show up identifications and the potential that we would introduce facial recognition technology into this same system, well, who's overwhelmingly and disproportionately represented in this system? Who's been stopped for a motor vehicle offense? Who's been stopped for standing on the corner smoking weed? Who's been stopped and booked for talking back to a police officer versus all of the people who have committed crimes but haven't been stopped because of where they live and the communities that they are in, but yet we'll introduce a technology that could be used to filter through this database of overwhelmingly Black and brown and poor folks to further criminalize people. So those are some of the ways that I think that it manifests within the system.
Yeah, so just to add on to that, I mean, it's almost as if we should start from the position of where doesn't it manifest in the criminal legal system? I mean, if we think historically about the criminal legal system and different aspects of it, from policing to courts to the use of prisons and carceral facilities, it has always been a durable feature of these institutions that they are racially biased or racist at root and intended in order to control marginalized groups on the basis of race, but also class-based oppression of marginalized groups as well. And so, you know, I think, of course, it's going to be in policing, and of course, it's going to be in courts. You know, historically, it has sort of shifted over time the degree to which we see disparities in these different aspects of the criminal legal system. But, you know, from history, slave patrols and sort of the emergence historically that historians have documented of slave patrols in the South converting into early forms of police departments as they became bureaucratized. And then also even in the North, the use of emergence of police departments in cities like Boston as a form of controlling non or racialized as other immigrant ethnic white groups, and then also working class folks. And so, you know, historically, we see variation over time in racial disparities. So we see over the period of mass incarceration. So, you know, we can say that period's from 1970s to now or so. Black-white racial disparities actually increased. And we also saw sort of within sort of the macro political environment, what was happening with respect to deindustrialization, but also with respect to how federal government and also local and state governments were increasingly thinking, how do we deal with what was a seeming increase in certain crime rates, but also how that was racialized and intended in order also to control racial groups who were protesting for rights and equality. And it was seen as using these tools of policing and prisons as a way to control these groups who were trying to be a greater part of the social polity and be a part of our social contract. And so we saw the rise of incarceration rates of racial disparities during that time. Peaked in the 90s, it's gradually declining now. So, seeing how it varies historically, I think is important, but also seeing how it varies across space is important. So racial disparities manifest differently in different jurisdictions. So, most of my work is on the courts and looking at court disparities. But incarceration rate disparities are actually quite easy to identify and see because we have good statistics on them. And we see there's wild variation across states, and that likely has a lot to do with different social policies and practices of institutionalized racism and systemic racism that determine those differences and the degree to which disparities exist. And within the court specifically, just to sort of add on to what Rasan was saying, I think in addition to bail and pretrial, also just prosecutorial power, I just wanted to highlight as another sort of dimension and place where we see sort of the way prosecutors sort of just kind of rubber stamp what's coming from police departments. So if police are targeting resources in certain areas, mostly Black and Latino areas, we see that sort of not being checked by the criminal court system. We would hope prosecutors would use their discretion in order to check sort of, frivolous arrests and also maybe check actual underlying differences in alleged criminal behavior. But we sort of see a lot of rubber stamping going on, and also even a heightening of racial inequalities that manifest from policing at times. There's a recent report that came out from at Harvard, which I think Rasan actually sent out for people to read, that looks at the effect of prosecutorial decision-making with respect to initial charge filing and how that has an effect. I also think differential treatment of defendants among defense attorneys is something that happens, and that is institutionally racialized. It's not necessarily about the individual intent of a defense attorney differentiating between their clients on the basis of race, but it is often about the lack of resources and time pressures that could allow implicit bias to operate. But also there are systemic features of the criminal legal system, such as the way the indigent defense system is set up. Institutionally disadvantages poor people and poor people of color in particular, and the quality of the defense they get. It's not necessarily that public defenders are bad at doing their jobs. It's just that they have a different caseload and they have different expectations in the courtroom work group than private attorneys who come in and defend clients spontaneously, if you will, rather than who are routine members of the courtroom work group and who have sort of established courtroom routines and expectations. So those are some of the ways that I see racism manifesting historically and also today.
Is it too complicated for me to just say what they said? Because I feel like I want to say what they said. We could do the full hour 15 on just what are the levels and what are the what are the levers for racial discrimination within criminal legal systems. There are a couple of different ways for me you can break it down. One is you can break it down into two buckets, which is anytime someone's making a decision or any system where anybody has made a decision, right? Creeps in there. Another way you can think about it is how people get sorted to have contact, how people get sorted into punishment, and then how that punishment gets decided into severity, right? So three kinds of sorting elements. That's how it works. And that's includes from before anyone has contact with public safety, all the way through the court systems, through treatment during incarceration, and through reentry. What I think is probably most useful for me in terms of how to cut nature at the joints, I remember one of the earliest set of conversations I had doing my work within law enforcement. Someone asked me what do I think law enforcement needed in terms of training. I get that question a lot. And I was like, I think they need a good sociology class. And the reason is, I'm a social psychologist, right? The reason is not just because the best of sociology gets to sound like Clair. It's because pretty early on, you learn that social phenomena happen at a micro level, the level of the encounter, At a meso level, we think about that as a level of a neighborhood, and at a macro level, right, as a city or nationally. And there are different mechanisms for producing those sets of things. So if we think about racial disparities between a city like Philadelphia and a city like Bridgeport, Connecticut, right, those are economic issues that are at least citywide, if not statewide, if not part of how we think about property tax and a national tax system. If we think about racial disparities between a place like Germantown, right, and a place like, let's say, University City, right, that's much more about where law enforcement thinks what the public has decided is criminal is happening, and therefore where they should go, whether they can measure, what they can hold themselves accountable for in terms of reports of, or what we've decided is criminal. And then if we think about the difference between how someone who looks like me gets treated versus someone who looks like Larry Krasner gets treated, then that's much more about the individual officer. I think it's really important that that is where I land, because again, our solutions are so often predicated on the idea that the problem is the difference between Larry and me. And the problem is really often the difference between Germantown and University City, and even more so, and even more invisible, the difference between Philadelphia and Bridgeport. Right? So you can cut this up any number of ways. Where human beings touch the criminal legal systems, that's where you're going to end up seeing bias, discrimination, and patterns of such, which become racism. But if you want to think about how to bucket that within the lane that you are looking into, micro, meso, macro, right? The level of the encounter, the level of the neighborhood, and the level of whatever is going to be larger than that: city, state, region, even country. And hopefully that provides something on top of all of the brilliance that just got dropped by my fellow panelists.
Thank you. You've all kind of touched on the difficulties of even kind of conceptualizing the criminal legal system as a single system, and certainly the challenges to causal inference. But to the extent you can, what do you think might be the causes of racial disparity or racism in the system, including but not limited to the systemic factors common to all criminal legal institutions? And you've touched on this a bit, but if you would have anything to add, starting with Professor Clair.
Yeah, so the only thing I guess I would really add here is I think oftentimes in the way we approach trying to disentangle what the causes are, we often sort of approach it first by saying, let's assume that there is no racial bias, right? And I think that's first I think that's historically invalid. I don't think that makes sense from what we know historically about the formation of these institutions. But also I think that obscures racial bias and racism when we just can't necessarily sort of tinker with and observe it. And so there's sort of a bucketing of unwarranted causes versus warranted causes often in the literature, and warranted causes are those that are assumed to be legally acceptable because they are based on, the criminal offense of people, or based on some other sort of legally valid difference. But these things, criminal records, for example, are racially biased to begin with, right? We've said this already, but sort of the neighborhood that you grew up and lived in, the neighborhood that you spend your time driving through, largely determines whether you're going to be picked up by the police or not. And so the creation of criminal records is racially biased, and therefore netting that out as if that's race neutral, it makes no sense. And it sort of focuses on these proximate, very close causes rather than reaching toward more fundamental, enduring causes. And so, I sort of, when people ask me what are the causes of racial disparities, I often say, well, racism of some form. There's no real other explanation unless you think there are inherent differences between racial groups, and then we need to have a whole nother conversation. And then the causes of the racism itself that produces the racial disproportionality, I think is, the long-term link between criminality and Blackness in the American imagination and in American policy since the beginning of this country. I don't have too much more to add, but I guess that's what I would really, if I had to, talk to people and say, when you're reading these studies, be critical in this way, that's how I would say you need to be critical, thinking about disentangling people's obsession with proximate causes rather than sort of understanding that the fundamental causes are almost always about racism of some form.
Yeah, it's a great formulation, Matt, and I'll echo that. You know, when I talk with folks in my classes who want to know about causality, and we do a lot of stuff on pretty close causal reasoning, I say you gotta know what you mean by cause, not just in terms of the statistical element of it, but in terms of what the question means to a particular audience. When kids ask where babies come from, they're probably not asking for the logistics of it, much to every parent's relief, right? There's something kind of mystical about it, like there's no life, but now there's life. What's there? Well, that's a harder question to answer. And if we're honest about that, we get to have better conversations and less awkward conversations with kids, right? In the same way, where does racism come from? Well, I could say it's Tuesday. And that's real in a place like Philadelphia, where depending on the day of the week, though I know nobody has quotas anywhere in policing, right? But you might end up with someone saying, well, it's Tuesday, so we got to go out and do X, Y, and Z, right? But that's not a satisfactory answer when we talk about causality. We want to understand, why does it have to be this way, right? And in part, the answer needs to be, it doesn't have to be this way, right? And it is this way because of a bunch of decisions that built on each other, and we never required that it be different, right? So I use, John Pfaff has a lovely portion of his book, Locked In, which talks about disparities in sentencing as driven by prosecutors, right? Like that's his whole argument, or at least the argument that I think is absolutely essential to engage. And so there, he makes this argument that if I am a county prosecutor and I convict somebody of a misdemeanor, where are they going to get locked up? Well, they get locked up in the county jail. Means my constituents pay for it. But if I convict somebody of the same crime, but I'm allowed to classify it as a felony, where do they get locked up? That'd be the state penitentiary. Well, if they're going to prison, my county is not on the hook for 100% of that. That's actually the state that pays for that. And he has information, has data that says prosecutors are thinking about that as they put that together. Now, that's not racist per se. That's a prosecutor making decisions about, because we elect prosecutors often, about their own election chances and what's best for their local constituents. But because we've criminalized Blackness so much, right, this perverse incentive produces a far more punishing criminal legal system than is what's required. If we valued Black life in the most vulnerable communities, we would have caught that and said, oh, that's messed up. Let's stop it. That's the thing I want people to catch. No malice was required on the part of generations worth of prosecutors at that point, right? Not saying it's not there, but it wasn't required for that decision. But if we cared about Black life the way that we should, the way that we care about other vulnerable groups, we would have looked at the outcome and said, oh, well, we see the mechanism. Let's get rid of that. And so when you ask about cause, I can talk about the neural substrates involved in automatic association and the visual tuning that connects to, and the ways that we should make inferences using hierarchical regressions that use count models. Like, we can get as technical as we want. We could also say it was Tuesday. And we can also say, because we let it be that way. And I think that of those three versions, I don't know all of the audience here, but those who are attracted to academics like the first one the best, because then it shows not just that we have an answer, but boy, aren't we smart. I think that folks who are administrators often go with the second one because it's the most proximate to the one outcome that you're asking about. And the kids and everybody else who's asking, they care about that last one. And it isn't more complicated than that. At least it doesn't have to be. It's hard to accept, because if you say we're not going to allow that to happen, we have to unroot a whole bunch of different systems. But that's the real answer. We allow it to be that way, even after we've seen it. And in fact, we are motivated not to see it so that we don't have to change it. And I think that's probably the most proximate answer to the question that most people really want answered when they ask the question.
Amen. You know, for me, it just comes down to white supremacy. Not only is it showing up in the people who operate the system, but the ideologies, rather, about who are the consumers of the system, the narratives around who are victims and who is worthy of being protected, and who are the perpetrators. This idea of prosecutorial power, whether it is actual power or reflective power, that power that is bestowed upon them from police and the legislature, that power to maintain a system of safety and of the maintenance of that power to control populations. And to Professor Goff's point, if we really cared about certain communities, the narrative about public safety would be different, right? For the prosecutor who has progressive ideals and values and really wants to make a difference in a community, but you're looking at a young person who's charged with the possession of a firearm, who lives in a community where there are a lot of shootings and some homicides and drug activity. And they are forced to make the argument that this person was found in a quote unquote high crime area with a firearm in the aftermath of a recent shooting, and therefore they were arrested. But what never gets examined is what is public safety? Why does this young person have a gun? Why is their community described as a high crime community? If we're getting to the root causes, education, trauma, substance use disorder, mental health issues, that's the public safety agenda. An overwhelming majority of what police end up responding to are things that grow out of mental health issues, substance use disorder, poverty, and trauma, and just general social control. But they're rarely, if ever, preventing crimes. They're responding to crime, but they're not preventing it. And so, if the people who are operators within this system are breathing the air of systemic racism, white supremacy, there's never going to be a questioning of why these things are happening and what can be done differently in a way that makes enough sense to really have an impact. And what I mean by that is it takes a complete retooling of the system to really get to that. And I think that's why we struggle, and we'll probably talk about this later, is this notion of defunding the police and directing more resources to community identified needs, because there's always going to be the argument that we need the police to keep us safe. But you look at some communities, like in Boston Police Department has a 13% homicide solve rate in Black community. Like, what are we paying for? What are the results that we're getting? And so when you think about how racial bias and racism shows up in these institutions and we get the results that we get, it raises this larger question about whose lives are valued and what is the narrative around public safety.
If you're seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that CLE codes will be announced twice per hour. Write down these codes and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory to receive CLE credits. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email and is also in the chat. The second CLE pass code is SWEATER, SWEATER. Sorry for that abrupt change, just trying to keep on time and in the background. But thank you for touching on that issue of kind of centering the defendant, right? The fact that prosecutors actually, the justice system is supposed to serve people who are accused of crimes too, that they're also part of the community, that they're the people, that they're also the people who are supposed to be kept safe, even when they're in jail, right? Like theoretically, but that doesn't seem to be at the center of the conversation. That's maybe that's one factor, but to get to our last question, before we get to audience questions, starting with Professor Goff, what factors do you think prevent criminal justice institutions from effectively addressing racial disparity or systemic racism and what institutional mechanisms or reforms could mitigate, reduce, or eliminate racial bias that you haven't already touched on?
All right, so I want to be relatively brief to both model that for my panelists and so we can make sure we get to some questions before we're out of time here. So first, humans fear change, and that's in the way. Also, folks fear loss more than they're excited about gain. And the idea that some of these changes would be simply to reduce the size of some of these bureaucracies, that's hitting people in the wallet. That's a scary place to hit people, right? It's also the case that folks are very nervous about what it means for them. So if the whole system has been jacked from the beginning, does that mean I've been part of a jacked system? Does that mean I am too? And all of that stuff is absolutely in the way. But I'd also say three things. We lack language to talk about this in a way that's straightforward for folks who are already threatened. Right? So when we talk about defund the police or abolish the police, that is terrifying to people I talk to regularly, right? And some people say that's just lunacy. What are you gonna do when there's violence? I was like, which kind of violence? Police violence or the violence in the street? Right? And they're like, well, you know what I meant. I was like, I don't, because in many of these communities, they're more scared of the former than the latter. Right? They're like, well, defund the police is just, I was just doing this on Twitter before we got here. Defund the police is, it stokes fear. I said, in whom? Right? But the point is not just that I'm good at dunking on people. The point is that we don't have the language for explaining that a good portion of what is meant by abolish the police is that folks should be able to have the resources so they don't have to have a crisis in the first place, that crime is a policy failure rather than a failure of individual will, right? And that when you do have a crisis, the public should be able to provide some set of resources that are responsive to the crisis. If my crisis is homelessness, why are you sending a badge and a gun instead of a roof and 4 walls? We don't have that language that makes plain in universally appealing values. So one of the elements is that. 2, we don't have the imagination. The reason why we're talking about reimagining public safety, it's not because everybody wants to be a screenwriter, though I'm sure that's true too. It's because we literally have a failure of public imagination to think about, well, what would a world look like where our response to a crisis in a community doesn't include crisis, violence and punishment, right? Just because someone doesn't like or doesn't trust law enforcement, that means they had to die? But if you watch what people have to say in the wake of a police shooting, if the suspect resisted, they said, well, if you just comply. We can't imagine as a society a world where that isn't the only outcome. So a lack of imagination is actually, it indicts us, right? And I'll give you a quick example of exactly what I mean. If you were to close your eyes, right, and imagine the world 200 years in the future, very easy to imagine flying cars, which by the way, we're overdue for those. Very easy to imagine nanobots that live inside our bodies and keep us living forever. Very easy to imagine that we take our whole meals from a pill, which again, that was wrinkle in time, we're overdue. But imagine a better democracy. What does a more just society look like? Do you have specifics? Is it as clear as the flying car? Our storytellers have not been telling those stories, and our leaders have not been leading us towards that vision. So we've lacked imagination. And the third thing I'll say that we've been lacking, serious analytics. And along with that would be the data. Now, Matt earlier said we have better data on incarceration, just friendly amendment. It's just better than all of the other data in the criminal legal system. I don't think he meant the data were good, because they are not. They are terrible. It's just that they are better than they are in the court system, which is still better than public safety, which has the worst data of any data collected anywhere in the history of the world. Without the data, it's hard to figure out what an evidence-led or just what an honest inquiry would look like. So if we think that law enforcement, which spends way less than 20% of their time in every city dealing with violence, if we think we can shrink the size of law enforcement without worrying that we're going to be encouraging violence elsewhere, by how much? Less than 20%, is it 4%? Is it 2%? Is it 10%? And if you don't know, it's very difficult to make a path. So these ideas, to the degree that they are new and they're scary, we lack language to make them plain and safe for people who are sympathetic, but for whom they are unfamiliar. We lack the imagination to really get, there can be a different way. And we lack the data to get specific about a plan to get us from here to whatever the heck it is that we're going to be imagining. If you put that in front of folks, even the folks who want to move will have a problem, which is what we've seen with the thousands of people that have called my center over the course of this summer. They're calling, they're saying, we want to do what protesters are asking for, but we need a plan, because we can't say we want to defund the police without saying how much money we're going to put into what else. That's where I'd start.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know that there's a lack of complete lack of imagination or lack of those stories. I am a huge fan of Afrofuturism, and it is the genre of casting a vision of a world where Black people are actually alive. Let's just start there. Like, we're here and we're present. But the imagination of what a peaceful society looks like. But you're also not wrong in that what is promoted about envisioning how the future looks is kind of bereft of any semblance of something that would resemble a post-abolition society. And I kind of echo this notion, like, people are just like, abolition, are you ridiculous? But, there was a point in this country where folks was like, the abolition of slavery, are you ridiculous? Like, that is the cornerstone and economic engine of this nation. How can we exist without it? And save the carve out in the 13th Amendment, we pretty much have gotten there. So I agree that there is the need for a greater collective imagination, and I guess I quibble a little bit with the data piece too, because we never have data when we want to criminalize more conduct. So it's not like we need the data to develop a plan, right? Because without fail, every time legislators want to introduce a new piece of legislation that criminalizes behavior, that increases sentencing or punishment, they haven't presented the statistical analysis of these particular crimes, if they were punished at a certain level, would keep us this much safer. It's just a knee-jerk reaction that grows out of fear. So it's really more so a lack of public will, because there's such an investment in maintaining power in traditional ways, and this narrative about the valiant hero, the folks in law enforcement, and I think that's what's really challenging for a lot of people. And the reality is, there are folks in community that are doing the things that are producing results, but nobody's really listening to them, or not enough people are listening to them. Grassroots abolitionist organizations that are saying, we are working with the people who are closest to the pain, and they are telling us what are the solutions to the malady that afflicts us, right? We are in a position to directly provide the services for those folks. So if we could focus on what's already happening and trust the imagination and also proven work of the folks who have been doing it, I think we could get a lot further.
Yeah, just to echo, I think it's about complacency and power. So, I think we have become complacent to sort of call the police when we have any sort of minor irritation in our lives. Someone's using the community pool when they shouldn't be. And we sort of, and by we, I mean privileged people, tend to just sort of give that role over to the state-empowered authority that has guns, rather than thinking about ways to engage with our neighbors, our communities. And there's a lot of complacency there. There's also power there, though. So there's power in the way that corporations have invested in police and police foundations. There's power in the way that politicians have used Black people as props to propagate stereotypes about criminality and fears about criminality. And so I think so much of the movement right now, the Black Lives Movement, that's so inspiring is this willingness and eagerness to shift the power and shift the conversation. So we see this in community bail funds. We see this in cop watching and surveilling police rather than having the police only surveil us. And so I think I take a lot of sort of, I think Rashawn's right, like the narratives and the vision is there, but we are not listening necessarily to marginalized people. I think now in the movement, defund abolition has moved to the center, at least within the movement, in a way that it wasn't at the center, post Ferguson and sort of during the Obama administration. And I think it's a really great moment of radical possibility, but to be honest, this has been going on for a long time, right? We had in the 90s critical resistance, we had Angela Davis writing, we have Dorothy Roberts' work, we have the work of Dylan Rodriguez, we had in the 60s so much work around prison abolition, not only in the United States, but also abroad in in Norway and other Nordic countries. So I think the ideas are there. I think the issue is that there's complacency sort of at the community and individual level, and then there's a lack of power to make these things possible. And part of it is going to be a framing issue and people's fears about what they've become complacent to expect and the way that they feel safe. But really the narrative should be about abolition is not about just blowing it all down. It's really about building up robust investments in communities, making it so that we're really working on prevention of harm and social problems, alongside also doing very systematic partial abolitions of the way that police are used, the way that prisons are used, and the way that courts are used to socially control and exploit people. And I think, we have Cahoot's program, we have critical resistance as examples, and we have at various local levels, just various different examples of community oversight and things like that that might lead us toward that possible future of abolition.
Thank you all. Now let's go to audience questions. Our first audience question, starting with Reverend Hall. And for the audience questions, we'll go in order, but with the option to answer. So if you don't feel like you have an answer right now, we can just move to the next person. So what recommendations do you have for a white line prosecutor who understands that systemic racism and implicit bias exist and wants to mitigate against those phenomena impacting the individual cases she has?
Yeah, I mean, that's complicated. I've been on panels with Rachel Rollins and Larry Krasner speaking to law students, and people ask, what would you tell young prosecutors or people considering becoming young prosecutors? And I would say, don't. And both Rachel and Larry would look at me like I'm crazy. But the problem is, in order to be in a position within those offices to make the type of systemic change, you need to be there for a while. And in order to be there for a while and get into positions of power, in most DA's offices, that comes through trial experience. And by trial experience, that means locking people up and convicting people at trial. And if you can tolerate that for a certain period of time, then I think that's fine. But otherwise, I think there's greater work that can be done on the outside, agitating and pushing and supporting people in community. I think you can interact on an interpersonal level with the police officers. You can question some of the stops that they made. You could refuse to prosecute certain crimes. You can engage in dialogue with your colleagues who have, if not overtly racist ideas, just kind of, racially biased ideas or ideas that are biased that are, kind of race neutral on the surface. And the more that you read, the more that you engage with people who are directly impacted, I think the more that your perspective is going to be changed. But the bottom line is you are a prosecutor. You are working in a system where you are an agent of the harm that is being perpetrated in communities that are overwhelmingly under-resourced, underfunded. And that doesn't mean that all, because there are like wealthy people who commit crimes and victimize other people too, but if taken in the whole, you are part of a larger system that is doing more harm in the most marginalized communities than good. So I think you can operate on an individual level, you can try to make systemic change, but in order to do that, you have to continue to be a part of that system. And I just think that there's greater work that can be done on the outside, agitating, working with and in support of abolitionists.
And Professor Goff next, actually. My understanding is you have a commitment at 5:15. So
Sure. So I had heard the question as being specifically for Rasan. I'll say that I frame the response of folks who were thinking about going into prosecution as an interesting one. I don't think that you make the kind of change that's necessary if you don't have an inside and an outside game, right? I can't see being on the outside and articulating clearly and forcefully and activating around your demands, and then not having institutionalists who do the sort of in the weeds work of uprooting those systems from inside. So I see incredible value of going into the belly of the beast and making yourself a nuisance like Jonah in the belly of the whale. But that's got to be a personal choice because he's not wrong. Like if you're being a prosecutor, you're going to be locking up folks from communities because of the ways in which we criminalize Blackness. That's your job. Now, even if you're working in progressive prosecution, they're not going to say we're going to remake America today and we're going to prosecute the set of laws that we think. Like, that's not a prosecutor's office. That's a coup. And we had a little bit too much of that in the last couple of weeks. So I don't think that that's a viable strategy. I do think that it makes sense if you've got a stomach for it to go into that space because, to be blunt, it's sometimes the harder work. The easier work is to figure out what it is that you believe and articulate that in a way that's compelling. The harder work is then to decide, okay, and now I need to figure out how to do that in a context where folks don't agree and where the structural momentum is in the other direction. But it's not work for everybody, right? So good luck wherever you're gonna go. Godspeed. It can happen anyway. How's that for a dithering answer on that?
Thank you, and sorry about the confusion for the question. Professor Clair, if you have an answer, and feel free to skip it here.
Yeah, it's sort of the same that was already given. Good luck. I will say, there's been some good organizing around, at least with respect to electing prosecutors and holding them accountable to doing partial abolitions within their DA's office. So that would be something maybe a line prosecutor could look up and try to be a part of. But I think, Phil's right. I mean, the institutional reasoning and the logic behind a DA's office is just completely misaligned with any sort of attempts at bringing down social control so someone who's a line prosecutor, I'm not sure how much work they can do with respect to that.
All right. On behalf of the Quattrone Center, thank you all for attending tonight, and thank you very much to our panelists. I wish we had more time, but I hope you all have a lovely evening, and thank you for your time.